All right, welcome everybody. Happy New Year. Children. Welcome back for the academic year. And to kick us off today, we're going to have a confirmation of candidature. But before that, it is traditional to acknowledge our elders, past and present. And today we welcome them here. And today we're presenting on Camaragal lands. And I'd like to thank elders, past and present, for their continual knowledge passed on to us and to future generations. So today we have a confirmation of candidature, Associate Professor Michael Reynolds. He's led by Professor Rhonda Craven as his principal supervisor, and co-supervisors are Professor Rich Ryan, Emeritus Professor Alex Young, Emeritus Professor Janet Mooney, Dr. Emma Bradshaw, Dr. Georgia Dumush, and Laurie Perry as well. And today on Michael's CoC panel, we have Professor John Marshall Reeve, Dr. Harry Ryan Jang, and is being chaired by Associate Professor Taryn Sanders. Without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you everyone for making the time to be here today and online, and a special thank you to Richard for calling from across the globe. Yuradumarang, Mujigalang, Yuandu Michael, Duramadilinga, Badu Radri Kapia, Yinjamara Camaragal Namba. It's acknowledging country in Wiradjuri, my language. And you'll see the, oh no, you won't. You'll see it in a minute. What have you done to me, Rick?
Give me a second.
You see this picture here that I've taken where I often like to go down to walks. I've been at ACU since 2021. In a continuing basis, and I'd like to take these walks down towards Berry Island. This is all on Camaragal country, and understanding how the university is situated in amongst Camaragal country. And I reflect on this and see that universities haven't always been a safe place. In fact, historically, often not a safe place for Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledges. An important way, Wiradjuri way of sharing knowledge is through storytelling. And I do hope through this presentation and throughout this investigation entirely that I really honour those Wiradjuri ways of storytelling, and hope that ways of storytelling can start to embed more fully into university environments here at ACU and actually across the university sector. My PhD is titled The Enablers of Success for Indigenous Australian Students University Completion. It's looking at psychosocial enablers that enable successful university completion for Indigenous people, particularly in Australia. It capitalises on the best of Indigenous approaches and Western approaches to research to find the answers to these questions that will positively impact Indigenous people and communities. In particular, I'll be looking at a few subgroups of interest. Firstly, looking at the cross ages, so school leavers versus mature age. Looking at geographical regions. What are the experiences for people from rural and regional areas versus students that come from urban environments? Looking at gender, and also looking to see what are the differences when it comes to people who are first attend university and family, just like I was. 3.3% of the Australian population identifies as Indigenous. However, you see that 47% of Indigenous people that start a university degree go on to complete. That compares to 74% of non-Indigenous people. There's a 27% gap in completion rates in this country for Indigenous people based on 2019 data, which is the latest data we have. We know that from 2021 census data that employment rates following successful completion of a bachelor degree or higher results in an 85% employment rate for Indigenous people, which is close to parity with non-Indigenous Australians. In 2021, Indigenous employment rate was 52% more broadly, and for non-Indigenous people, it was 75%. I'm pleased to say there has been an increase in access rates. So Indigenous students coming to university for the first time since 2008. In 2008, we had 1.3% of Indigenous students coming to university. In 2019, it was 2%. ACU is about on the national average when it comes to that. However, despite seeing an increase in access rates, we're not seeing an increase in completion rates. And so that reflects a real lack of translation from students that are coming into university through to completing their degrees, which is a real problem because that's the main driver for employment at the end. I'm a Wiradjuri man. I grew up on Wadamadagal land in Sydney. I live on Wadamadagal land. I'm talking to you now from Gamarabal country. I have a loving wife, 2 boys, and my mother's part of the stolen generation. Our identity and our knowledge is shaped by who've come before, and if we keep our minds and our hearts open, we become stronger people. The Wiradjuri word for intelligence is Wujja Durai. Wujja means ear and Durai means to have. So literally intelligence is to have ears. And my successful journey, first as a younger Wiradjuri man going through university training to become a physiotherapist and throughout my career, really isn't just explained through sheer dumb luck or any academic aptitude, but it's actually also explained by listening and learning from people who believed in me, how much I believed in myself, and how much I was motivated by the right things that sought help where I needed it. Coming more broadly, looking at the Australian context, I direct you to the Indigenous Australia Indigenous Strategy Report, which was released late last year as part of their broader strategy. And they identify 4 key elements to improving completion rates of universities in this country. Culturally responsive, one-on-one academic support. Peer mentoring, so peer-to-peer, between peers, through different years, through people like me who are maybe more established, and through industry and through Indigenous higher education units. Indigenous higher education units here are also across almost every university in the country. Some universities are also incorporating Aboriginal wellbeing plans. We know through peer-reviewed research to generate success for Aboriginal people, Indigenous people at university, we need to be looking towards strategies to improve Indigenous social and emotional wellbeing. Indigenous higher educations are well established and become really important networks and hubs for Indigenous people as they enter these largely Western academic institutions, a culturally safe place where people can connect and have different programs and get supports where they need it. Some of those supports include targeted academic programs, but then other supports aren't just within the university walls. We need to look towards what's happening in family and community, because Aboriginal people often have different lived experiences than other non-Indigenous people. We need to look towards family and community supports and financial supports for students that require it. These strategies are fantastic, and there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of good intent, and in fact some of them have been quite successful, but they lack a strong theoretical basis. If we look at Indigenous standpoint theory, research traditionally with Indigenous people was about Indigenous people and not by and with Indigenous people. It was about them. And that by doing that, you lack the richness in knowledge that you require and the lack of engagement you get with Indigenous people to have a real impact on people and communities. Historically, discourse regarding Indigenous people was also largely deficit-based and saw Indigenous people and issues as problems to be fixed. That just perpetuates negative stereotypes and, in fact, racism. We do know collectively, though, there's many strengths that Indigenous cultures bring and to be celebrated and capitalised upon through more holistic, culture-centred views and with the principles of positive psychology. We know also self-determination theory has developed as an important framework for what drives success in life's endeavours, including education. Satisfaction of the basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence and relatedness are strongly associated with greater success in life and in educational environments, and gives really important insights into motivations behind behaviours that drive this success. Unfortunately, however, or yet to be done, is looking at how much self-determination theory has been shown to be tested in Indigenous environments, either within Australia or even globally. Self-concept theories had a significant evolution as well over recent years. And importantly, we know that self-concept improves with academic achievement and reciprocally, that academic self-concept drives higher academic achievement. And although there's been some significant advances in our understanding of how self-concept drives success in Indigenous people, this is yet to be tested in university environments. So this research will bring together Indigenous ways of doing these things, along with very strong, robust Western theoretical frameworks of self-determination and self-concept theory, which I think are really important frameworks for understanding what drives Indigenous success, both here at ACU and across the country within the higher education sector. Which comes to the present investigation. So the present investigation will look to bring together international advances in those theories: Indigenous standpoint theory, positive psychology of Indigenous thriving, self-determination theory and self-concept theory across 3 studies. First study is a systematic review looking at the global literature, looking at the nature between psychosocial enablers and completion for Indigenous students. Study 2 will be a qualitative piece where we look at interviews with Indigenous university students and Indigenous academics that look to see what they perceive are the psychosocial factors that enable or thwart university completion. Study 3 moves the focus more towards policy and practices, and I'll ask the same Indigenous university students and university academics what they perceive are their preferences for university policy, practices and interventions that help drive their success and completion at university. So let's begin with Study 1. Study 1 is our systematic review and consists of 3 main research questions. The first one is focused more on self-determination theory. And looking at, from a self-determination theory perspective, what is the nature and scope of international research that looks at the relation between needs satisfaction or dissatisfaction and university completion? Research question 2 will focus more on from a self-concept theory perspective and look to see the link between psychosocial factors that also enable completion internationally. The third question focuses more on subgroups. Those subgroups I talked about being different geographical regions. In this case, we'll be looking at comparing across countries and cultures, but also urban versus rural, age groups, so school leavers versus mature age, and for people first in family and of different genders. It'll be conducted in accordance with Campbell collaboration guidelines. Search terms will be identified and then a strategy conducted across various databases. It'll include qualitative peer-reviewed studies with higher education settings globally with Indigenous people with an outcome of university completion or completion of studies. Studies will be sorted through covenants and screened for eligibility. Quality appraisal process will be undertaken using the Critical Appraisal Skills Program checklists. And data analysis will occur, including coding, synthesising and thematic analysis of identified studies with other researchers in line with Bohr and Clark. Coming to Study 2, so Study 1 is a systematic review. Study 2 now looking at psychosocial factors for Indigenous Australian university students. And we'll look at, again, you see 3 research questions here as well. One is looking at the basic psychological needs, what they perceive they need to succeed and complete their university degrees. Then what is the relationship between academic self-concept in particular, so academic self-concept of Indigenous students and university completion. And then thirdly, how does this manifest through different subgroups? What are different subgroups thinking about this? And this provides the basis for participants that we've got here. So it's a total of 62 participants through various subgroups and including academic leadership. The students will be drawn, and we've got the numbers for this at ACU. So the students will be drawn from ACU alumni, students and ex-students across 6 campuses, Indigenous academics and academic leadership at ACU, but also will need to be across other universities as well. We aim to recruit for a gender balance of male equals female and roughly half of first generation at the university, first in family. This will involve qualitative research methodologies. It'll include semi-structured interviews, which provide a way to provide a greater depth to understanding of our research questions and more probing. And as we do that, focus groups allow for a connection across participants to provide support for each other, a greater richness of ideas as well, and also culturally supportive spaces for them as well. Participatory action research aims to have participants affected by the research have the ability to act in the research. And this can help shape the themes from the contributions they make. This can be through checking, through data checking and thematic themes checking, and their voices will remain strongly present within the research and indeed maybe hopefully with the impact that this research will have. Some of you may not be quite as familiar with yarning methodology, And yarning methodology was something that was first presented in the literature by Bill Bessera back in 2010, and has become widely used in Indigenous research methodologies, qualitative research methodologies. We start with a social yarn. A social yarn is a fairly informal, unstructured way of getting to know participants. And it's the idea is to build relationships and to develop trust. Might be if you or I went down and had a coffee with one another if we didn't know each other, and we talk about things that we feel more comfortable with. Moving on to the research topic yarn, and it's exactly what you might be thinking. And this is about the research topic itself, with the objective of asking the questions that we want answered through the research. In this case, understanding what are students' academic self-concept and how do they think that drives their success at university, their completion at university, and also looking at how their needs of autonomy, competence and relatedness maybe have been satisfied or not. We understand that having yarns like this, like conversations like this, might create some heightened emotion and maybe even traumatic for some people. And so we have a therapeutic yarn here as well. And this allows participants to voice their concerns or just speak to the researcher in a really safe way where there's a lot of listening happening from the researcher and in fact no therapy provided by the listener apart from active listening. And if there are further supports required, then participants can go and seek those further supports afterwards as well. The collaborative yarn is there to help with further knowledge generation, and it's an opportunity for participants to share their thoughts and ideas and knowledge, which is often connected to the research, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And backing can occur through checking of themes and other conversations, or also and has the aim to help empower the participants and create further positive change for them. Moving on to study 3, which is university policies and practices that facilitate degree completion. The study 1 was our systematic review. Study 2 was looking at more of an individual level on how they saw themselves as succeeding and how their psychosocial factors would help them complete at university. This one looks towards how well universities support them. Research questions here looking at the same Indigenous students and the same Indigenous academic leadership in study 3. And we're looking to see which university policies and practice do they perceive as being psychosocial drivers for their success. And importantly, across those subgroups, how do those subgroups see that occurring as well? Are we supporting rural Indigenous students the way we should be? Or are we just focused on our urban Indigenous students? Are we focusing more on men versus women, or is it the reverse? Are we focusing on first generation people enough to improve those completion rates? Methods used for study 3 will be the same as study 2, so I won't go into that any further. Ethics approval will be sought from HU Human Research Ethics Committee and the Indigenous Research Ethics Advisory Panel, and that'll be conducted this year. And they'll adhere to the IATSIS Code of Ethics and the NHMRC guidelines for conduct of research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The IATSIS Code of Ethics and its 4 principles include Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous leadership, impact and value, and sustainability and accountability. And the NHMRC guidelines are centred around 6 core values of spirit and integrity, cultural continuity, ethics, respect, reciprocity, and responsibility, which hasn't always historically been evident, particularly when we're looking at research with Indigenous peoples. Here is my timeline, and 2024 has been a busy year for me. I'm a physio, and moving into like a psychology space, an educational psychology space, has been a very exciting and challenging experience for me. And this year has been involving me getting to know a lot more about self-determination theory, self-concept theory, understanding, and qualitative research methodologies, attending Asprey Foundations qualitative methodologies courses, and others. 2025 will involve a further 2 chapters being written on literature review and methodology, getting a start on that systematic review, getting ethics approval, and doing some of the prep work for studies 2 and 3, with interviews occurring towards the latter half of this year or then moving into next year. You'll see the yellow here is all the chapters that I need to be writing to relate the thesis. The purple is some of the activities, not exhaustive, but they're the activities involved with each of the studies, and the green are my milestones. To give you a summary of what it will look like at the end, hopefully, this introduction and summary at the beginning and end, looking at a lit review and the need for this research, which hopefully I've articulated today, theoretical overview of how we're using these Indigenous and Western theories, aims, research methods, research questions and the rationale, methodology, and those 3 studies that I talked about, the systematic review, the psychosocial enablers for Indigenous students, and then 1, how do policy and practices within universities support that. Wandangu, thank you.
I'll hand over to Taryn to do the Q&A.
Yeah, so great job, Michael. It was really a lot of sort of picking up on the policies that involve the donors supporting that. I have a couple of questions for you. I'll start with the theoretical, which is that in both the document and in the presentation, we talk about how you different theoretical backgrounds. And that was quite the studies to link them quite nicely to the Western theories. So how do you see that Indigenous theories? Is it just through yarning, or is there another link in Indigenous theories?
So
informing that?
it's interesting. So you think about knowledge production in Indigenous ways. It's through, I mean, it's not just through yarning. There's lots of different ways that Indigenous people have shared knowledge and often being on country as well. So I'm looking towards leaders in Indigenous research, particularly Australian Indigenous research, to help guide the methodological process. When we look at a robust theoretical overview, if we're looking at Western frameworks for understanding theory, they don't really sit very well with a lot of Indigenous knowledge. So if you start to apply what makes a Western theory robust, if you look at what makes why is SDT so strong, or why is self-concept theory and these things I talked about so strong, we can't apply that same framework for Indigenous knowledges. So there needs to be a little bit of a compromise, a little bit. And so the way I've seen them marrying together, and Rhonda's done a fair bit of this as well in terms of in her RRPM, so in the reciprocal research partnership model, where we start to look at this Indigenous perspective about what is important for community, what's important for Indigenous people, making sure that's being heard, hence the need for Indigenous standpoints, and hence the need to move away from a deficit discourse. So having this, essentially that approach, which is actually really critical, but then applying really robust Western frameworks, or largely Western frameworks of SDT and SC, which is how we're going to bring them together. But I'm certainly open for any other comments on how you might bring them together. The interesting thing as well, we looked very carefully, there's a lot of quant research done as well, particularly on SDT, and it becomes really challenging to do that in a way that stays very true for Indigenous ways of knowledge production. So we had a good discussion as a team early on, in fact, very early on, and probably came to a decision fairly early as well, that could we do this in a quant way, or it could be a mixed methods kind of approach. And we felt staying true to more Indigenous ways of knowledge production, that a qualitative approach was probably the best.
Yeah.
But it'll remain a constant tension.
Yeah.
It'll remain a tension.
So in studies 2 and 3, especially study 2, you're interested in factors related to students remaining in university, so things that are made and things that thwarted that.
Yes.
Are you only talking to students who are current students?
Yeah, not quite actually.
Okay.
And I could have made that clear on the slides. When we go back to participants, please read them. We're looking at, as part of our subgroups, we're looking at people from urban environments who complete and who don't complete. And then also people from rural environments who complete and not complete. And so it also becomes challenging then as well, I don't know if you're already thinking this, that how do we know they're going to complete if they're still here? So if they're close to completion or an intention to complete, then we still need to unpack exactly how we define completion, or whether we just look at alumni. But we still need to unpack that a little bit in terms of exactly who's going to be in each of those subgroups. And that's same for people that have dropped out. Are we looking at completely at only ex-students, and we're trying to contact them somehow, or are we looking at people who are at risk? And I suspect that'll probably be the definition, and that'll need to be done sensitively with Indigenous higher education units. That's also the benefit we have containing that largely within ACU as well, because I've got very good relationships with all our Indigenous higher education units, and in fact, across academics across the university.
That's fair. My concern is that when you got good understanding of what the laws and information.
Yeah, and I think, in fact, I remember Alex made a point in this as well as part of that submission as well. It needs to be included in there. Otherwise, we have a whole subset of people that we're not serving well, and they're part of that gap. They're part of that gap, and if we don't include them in this research, we can't answer the question adequately. So I think looking at those people who are at risk of dropping out, or people that have not completed, I think it's really important to capture those, and so they'll be really important subgroups in this research, I suspect.
One last question, and I'll invite questions from there. In the third study, you're asking about policies and practices of university staff, like university providers. So,
Yes.
do you think that students know what university policies are?
Yes.
Certainly, they might recognise the ones that have been happening. But would they recognise a policy that existed that benefited from it?
Exactly. And I think this is the importance of bringing in some of the Indigenous leadership. And there's a lot of challenges, because if we just include Indigenous leadership who understand what the policies are, we lose that student voice. If we only include students, that you're right, they don't have an appreciation for that. So there's going to need to be, as part of that process, to articulate what those policies and practices are. Now, if this was a multi-site trial across 6 different universities, that's a huge task. But if we're looking at focusing on one site or one university, ACU, which actually has a national footprint, so it gives us really good data across there, but we look at ACU policies and practices in particular, which are, I think they could be a lot better, but they are reasonably well articulated. We can actually say, well, how well does this support you? So if we look at people that are considering, well, we're not doing PhDs, but let's say if I was looking to see how well are you supported to do your PhD at university, I can strongly stand here and say, this university absolutely supports me as an Indigenous man to do my university, and that's supported by Enterprise Bargaining Agreement 6.2, don't know the separate subclause. But I know that that's happened, and I know a lot of people have supported that. And I know there's people in the room that have supported that as well, so I could report on that. Students will have different experiences, and it might be that that when we look at, let's say we look at curriculum development, what our standards are for curriculum development. Well, currently we've got all this stuff around Indigenous cultural and intellectual property coming out, cultural safety in classrooms. There's all these things in train, both in particularly the faculties of education and health sciences. I think if we can draw upon some of those policies that are established and further in development and see how they're impacting on students, that will give us really good richness in data. And it actually makes it really practical for the university, and actually is quite scalable then as well, I suspect. So that'll be a challenge, absolutely.
I have a question from John Marshall or Adrian.
So that I had a couple of options, but you already presented it well, but the whole studies. And also Karen gave me some similar questions, but I'm still not clear about the one thing, which is about how I want to apply the Indigenous perspective to your study. You mentioned something about some methodological, but from my understanding, if I'm correct, based on your manuscript, you explained 2 different Indigenous theoretical frameworks, which one is the ISP, and the other one is classic psychology.
Yes.
And you mentioned that it is important to see SDT framework, kind of basic needs and self-concept through the Indigenous lens. Then I'm not sure how I want to study these frameworks, basic needs and self-concept through the Indigenous lens. And I expect that then, okay, this is the Indigenous perspective of basic needs and self-concept. Then identify this concept or enablers through the interview. That's what I expected.
Yeah, a little bit. So I suppose it comes with a little bit of, I'm speaking from an Indigenous perspective now. Let's say if a questionnaire goes out to Indigenous people and it's not done by Indigenous, and you haven't established relationship or established any of that, they will give different responses than if it was in a yarning environment. It will be different. Absolutely will be different. And I know that Indigenous people would attest to that. And there's some of the distrust about how that's being used. So there's a data issue there, but there's always also a trust issue. Indigenous people, the way we connect with each other is relationally. So it's how we connect. And if we're looking at a broader concept, it's not just how we connect with people, it's how we connect with country and customs and culture and all these sorts of things. But that connection is really important. So that in itself helps to generate knowledge. And so that's the lens that we need to look at this through. So if I sent out a questionnaire, even if it was well-intentioned and it was me and it came with a good, and I developed some sort of relationship beforehand, I tried to get them to answer as truthfully as they should around what they felt their self-concept was, or around what how well they felt their needs were being met. You're going to get a really different response, and it actually doesn't honour Indigenous ways, and the research that results at the end of that isn't going to be as well accepted by the Indigenous community. So when we look at an Indigenous standpoint, you're creating that richness of knowledge using traditional and current Indigenous ways of sharing knowledge. But then when we look at, so that's the Indigenous standpoint theory piece. And when we come down to the positive psychology and Indigenous thriving piece, that provides a framework for that to have, for Western frameworks to start to dovetail with that. It's not going to be perfectly. There's always going to be this tension where we come to the cultural interface, where there's this cultural tension, where there's this sort of toing and froing about, is what we're doing right for Indigenous people as actions or right for these other theories? And that'll be a feature of this whole investigation to be interesting.
Yes. And this address that point in your manuscript, then that would be much better.
I think yeah, I'd agree. That probably needs to.
I think this is the lens that your main.
Yeah, I think I contend that the challenge, there's quite a lot there. You know, particularly tackling SDT and self-concept, and I think I need to unpack that a lot more as well in terms of how those two interact. I think we still don't know enough about that in terms of how we can. I don't think there's been enough done, which is looked across self-concept theory and SDT, and then we're starting to bring Indigenous perspectives. It's not going to be, I suppose, perfect marriage, I think, but we need to understand where the limitation of biases are. And I would think that would be a major criticism of that draft chapter, I think, in terms of how we bring those together. But I can see how that'll continue to be a tension when we ask these questions. Studies 2 and 3, but thanks, it's really helpful feedback.
Most basic top level question. I think that the aim is to identify enablers of success being defined as graduating universities. Basic premises, then you're going to identify 62 students in all these different cities, and you're going to interview them. Now, if the graduation rate is only like 1% or some statistic like this, it's low.
47%.
So it sounds to me that they won't know. How are you going to identify the enablers from people who are dropping out and struggling and lost in the system and detached? I don't think you'll get your hand. They'll have the answers for it. So could you respond to that?
Well, this is something that I still need to work through with the team, obviously. When we're asking questions about people about how well their relatedness was supported, for example, and seeing and presuming that is in some way contributing to their success, we can ask questions. It's fairly well established. We can ask questions about how well their relatedness was supported. And then they go on to complete, we can look to see, well, is there a relationship with people that feel more supported and complete versus people that don't really feel as well supported or didn't engage with Indigenous higher education units, for example, or didn't have family that believed in them or weren't as well supported by by community. Maybe they were isolated, coming off country. Maybe the connectedness for people coming from rural and regional areas will be different for people from urban environments because they don't have relatedness satisfied as well as they could. Maybe they come from, and people come into university from different pathways. So there might be different areas of like academic skills, performance and ability to study, which will affect their confidence. And also in terms of how we teach at universities, it's not always very autonomous. It doesn't really support autonomy in always very well. And that's going to vary across different disciplines and across different teachers. There might even be different beliefs that in terms of how they felt teachers connected with them or lecturers connected with them at university, which drives the success. And certainly there is some literature to support those views. And I think we can ask people that. The question is, how close are they to completing? How do we put people in that completion bucket versus the non-completion subgroup? I think with some of them, particularly early on, I agree, I think we'll lack any sort of hindsight or maturity to know, are they doing well or not? Are they going to complete or not? So I suspect a lot of this is going to need to be pitched towards people in the last 1 or 2 years of their degree, once they've got some runs on the board. And I think that also is going to be more pertinent for this question as well, which focuses on completion as opposed to access and retention. So I'm not going to say it's not a challenge, but I think it sounds plausible that we could do that. But I'm happy to receive any other suggestions on how to best do that.
What do you think likely answers will be? What will be then?
So anecdotally, when I look at this, if students are connecting with Indigenous higher education units, they've got people that believe in them. So they've got a lecturer that believes in them. If they've got a cohort of peers, so if you've got one person going through a course versus 6, we know that they're more likely to connect with others and connect with Indigenous higher education, and they're more likely to succeed. And that's what I hear when I speak to all the Indigenous higher education units here. And from a physiotherapy point of view, which I know quite well, that seems to be what drives success in physiotherapy degrees nationally. So it's how well connected they are. That relatedness piece, I suspect, is going to be really important. The competence piece is interesting, and it'll be interesting in ACU because we have different entry requirements versus other universities. So I'm not quite sure what to read into that yet. I think it's an important question to ask. The academic self-concept piece is important. The reciprocal effects model is quite important. It's quite interesting as well. And the other thing I'm really interested in, sorry, coming back to SDT a little bit, around motivation. So what motivates people? And I understand that people will be all different stages along that motivation continuum in terms of SDT, where they're fairly unmotivated. I see that students, they fail, they have to get a post-assessment or something, and then they just lose it. They think, no, I don't have this, I don't have the skills to this, and they just withdraw. We see that broadly. We see it more disproportionately with Indigenous students, but then I also see ones that get over, particularly from in allied health science, where I'm more directly involved in. Once people get over that first hurdle and they have this built-up academic self-concept, they don't only just scrape by, they fly, and they turn themselves into distinction students. And that can't be explained only through competence. It's we think it's explained by people being in more control of their behaviours, so autonomy, but certainly that relatedness and seeing other people do it. Other people standing up and giving a lecture, or other people that have gone through themselves. So there are organisations in industry that actually provide a really good support for students, like Indigenous Allied Health Australia. I'm sure there's other education places as well, and the Australian Indigenous Psychology Association that provides support for students at a university level. But when people start to connect with those sort of things, they tend to do better. The ones that don't connect tend to not do so well. That's anecdotal, but I'd certainly hope that this research starts to flesh that out a little bit further.
Yeah, we've got a couple of things together. So you've got all these interviews. You have the experience of training or mentoring to analyze the data.
Sorry?
Take the transcripts and turn it into.
Do I have experience doing that?
I saw you're going to get some, workshop.
Yeah, I've done some workshops and training. I've co-supervised some honours projects, qualitative honours projects as well. I'll continue to get further training on thematic analysis, mostly through Asprey. and work with my team to make sure we do that right. Who also have experience in yarning methodologies as well. For Indigenous.
That's gonna be good. Yeah, so you've got the transcripts, you've analyzed. I think you're using the four theories. To sort of interpret or code, like this sounds like dissatisfaction, sounds like the.
Yeah.
So the ultimate end would be not just the story, but if you want to do something about it, like make a causal interpretation, like if they had a stronger relationship or a mentor.
It's interesting. It's going to be really, this is something I've grappled with in terms of a causal interpretation of it is going to be challenging. I think that's something that still needs to be involved, but certainly we'll see strong associations between different things. And
Okay, why do this? Is it so they can tell their stories or that you can help them solve it?
so they can help them solve their problems. These are problems that haven't really been looked at in this way before. So it's, if anything, it's a little bit more exploratory. And there's a lot of theories on there as well. We can't look really robustly at different elements of that where we can have really strong causal interpretations. The power's not even strong enough either. There's only, in each subgroup, there's only 8 people or 6 people in each subgroup. So it's kind of small, but if we start to see some strong association, that provides a groundwork for more robust research where we could look at how does this affect rural Indigenous Australians? How is autonomy supported learning doing that? How is satisfaction of relatedness related to completion in this group? And we can have something that's a bit better powered. I'm not sure that I'll get, and particularly across 6 campuses as well. I think it's even if we did it in a really robust manner, and I think there is definitely merit in doing that to provide a framework for future research, but that'd need to be in my head, that needs to be the topic of further research beyond PhD.
Open to the floor, Herb?
Question. Isn't there an overlap between studies 2 and studies 3, particularly from the students? I mean, the enablers from the student's perspective could well be a policy.
Right.
Yeah. So that'll be a separation. One of the other things I've had a sense of it, it's beyond the scope of what you're going to be able to do, but it would be very interesting to be able to speculate on how many of the recommendations that you come up with are uniquely Indigenous. Because I suspect that an awful lot of the things that you're talking about will be good for people in general. It's not.
Absolutely, they will be.
Yeah.
And I hope that's the case.
Yeah.
So when we look at self-concept and self-determination theory, when we look at it cross-culturally, we see that it works across different cultures and different environments. I suspect these things will be true for Indigenous people as well, stepping short of having a strong causal link. But I think it'll give us a really strong indication that we need this. These are the kind of policies and practices that we need to be putting when it comes to that. So I think to your first, backing up again to your first question, I think it's natural as part of that research topic yarn that people will start to say, oh, the university supported this, I accessed this, I did this. And it's really up to me as the researcher to actually then probe more on those questions. It's going to make data collection a little bit more challenging, and we're going to have to have a strong rubric and understanding, I suppose, for how we're going to extract that data.
Will the students in study 2 and study 3 be overlapping as well as the content?
Yeah. So the students will be the same. So the students and the academic leadership will be the same, and it'll be done at the same time as well. So, and that makes sense as well, because people naturally will then want to talk about how universities are supported. And that might provide a method then, that might provide an in then to ask more about, well, how did it support you? And then start to focus on particular elements.
One other contribution I think the thesis could make that would be a really important standalone chapter or section is what is it that constitutes Indigenous methodology? Because a lot of what you're saying is that it hasn't been, people haven't looked at Indigenous methodology. And so if you could put together some notion as to what constitutes indigenous methodology, and things that are required, things that are recommended, things like that.
I think it's a really good point. And when it comes to writing that methodology chapter, that's going to need to be explained in some detail. I think, and whether that's a standalone chapter, Indigenous research methodologies, Western.
Well, I guess what, from my perspective, I see lots of people talking about indigenous methodology. And it would be nice to have standalone chapter or section within the methodology section that said, this is what constitutes, from my perspective, from your perspective, indigenous methodology.
I think that's incredibly important. And it would have been nice to talk about that a little bit more today. Indigenous research methodology isn't just yarning, but it's probably one of the key things that I would use in this. But there is a lot more to unpack there. I appreciate your feedback and come back to the mid-candidature a little bit then.
Any other questions from you and online?
Is anybody else on?
Anything else? All right, well, can you thank Michael and a round of applause? Thanks very much. Thank you, Michael. I just asked the Michael's panel to stay online and I'll get it convened over to the boardroom. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, really good. Thanks very much for being here, guys. Thanks, Rich and Rhonda. Mate, that's a very cute baby you got there. Anyway,
Thank you.
see you. Okay.
He was talking about me, Emma.
You big baby.
That's good job.
Hear us from the boardroom? Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear us?
Yep.
I think the baby's just taken over. That's why it's everybody here? Emma, can you hear us?
I can, thanks.
I'm just going to stop the recording. Just give me 1 second, then you're up.